Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and it's time for our regular dive into the news to think about some of the stories that have been making the headlines over this past couple of weeks. And fresh from Blackpool with Rock and a tan, we've got John Stevens, our National Director. Good morning, John.
Hi, Phil. Mine's a fake tan.
Okay, very good. And I've got Adrian Reynolds with us as well, our Head of National Ministries. Good morning, Adrian.
Good morning. In the news is that we haven't seen, apart from one brief moment, we haven't seen the sun for the whole of November.
No, well, there we are.
Nor
there
did
we
we
are.
in Blackpool.
Oh, it wasn't too bad in Blackpool. I enjoyed a jog along the front. It was quite nice. That was before the sun rose.
It was a happy time. That's the main thing.
It was a happy time. We'll talk about that in a few minutes because we do want to pick up on our leaders' conference and how grateful we are to the Lord for that. Brothers, there's no getting away from the fact that there have been some sobering headlines in the news, particularly this week. I want to start there with the publication of the Makin Report. So this details the appalling abuses of John Smythe, who was in charge of boys' camps through the sort of 70s and 80s. And what's clear here is not just the abuses, which were very well known, I think, previously, but what this report does is it talks about how, although the whistle was blown, this seemed to be covered over. Many people named in it. The Archbishop has resigned. This has been absolutely harrowing and sobering. And I want to start by saying we need to give thanks for those brave people who spoke up, and we need to lament that they were not listened to.
I think that's exactly right, Phil. And first and foremost, with any of these things, which, as you're right, are very sobering, we do always need to be thinking about people who are victims. Yeah. And it's an extraordinarily traumatic report to read. I mean, in a sense, the abuse that was suffered by many of the by all of the victims was already in the public domain, has been for a few years now. But that didn't make it any less harrowing to read. I found it very, very difficult. I could hardly read some of it. And just to think that this was going on under the auspices of something that claimed to be Christian and evangelical, I think is horrific at all kinds of different levels. So yes, our prayers do need to be, and our thoughts with those who have suffered.
Then the Archbishop resigned for his part in it, John. Yeah,
I mean, I've read the report. I've read the full report. I've read the kind of appendices to the report. I mean, as Adrian said, at one level, the abuse was known anyway. I'd read Bleeding for Jesus by Andrew Greystone, which had laid bare the horror of what John Smythe had done when that came out into the public sphere. I think reading the report, one felt shocked. You couldn't help but feel shamed by it and what it said. One couldn't help but feel sullied by having any interaction with the world that might have done some of those things. And the report is worth recognising what it was. It was a more limited report looking into the failings institutionally of the Anglican Church and specific people within it to have handled the abuse. And I think what was so shocking reading it was as Makin discovered, what he described as an active cover-up of what took place. And actually, in some ways, I found the appendices even more shocking than the report itself, because they have the correspondence between lots of the people who were involved and how they were talking about it and what they were doing and what their motivations were and what they were afraid of. And it just sort of is, that is deeply kind of shocking. I think what is shocking is the disregard for the victims from the beginning. I think there are things in there that there was a lack of care for the victims. They weren't consulted about what they would have wanted. I think the fact that people knew the seriousness of the abuse, the fact that they recognised it was a criminal offence but still didn't do anything. I think Makin recognises it was different in the 1980s, but even by the standards of those times, what was done was completely unacceptable. It's not just those that were involved, whether within the Anglican Church, Ewan or whatever, that Winchester School equally covered up the abuse. There are other agencies, charities, individuals who are not within the Anglican Church that are picked up on in the report and not investigated because it's not within kind of the remit. And clearly what started out as something being protected by a very small group, I think, again, Makin makes clear this became a quite open secret within a large group of people. And quite a number of people are named as having known something. The report doesn't quite tell you how much they knew or what circumstances. But again, there is this sense that this was something that was much more widely known than kind of those of us on the outside might have ever imagined. So that is all, I think, shocking. The Archbishop of Canterbury's resignation, I think, was inevitable.
Did he come too late?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, why did he need to resign? Because basically the report found him personally culpable for having failed to properly care for the victims when this became known to him in 2013. So 2013, victims were beginning to come forwards, and the church did not do enough to pursue that. And actually, Makin concludes that the Archbishop of Canterbury had a responsibility to do more, that he, in a sense, was morally, personally accountable. So it wasn't just institutional failing, it was his personal failing in this situation. He had connections with John Smythe along the way. He ought to therefore have pursued this with a vigour, and then also kind of promises to meet with victims that weren't followed up on. So there's a sort of a failure to kind of deal with it appropriately. And I think what makes it so shocking is that all of what was done clearly made it possible for Smythe to go on abusing in Africa, abusing his own family. And the report talks about 115 victims, the vast majority of whom were basically in Africa. And I think
there may be other victims we don't know about.
Yeah, the culpability of the Archbishop was, and others in the institution, is basically because after 2013, Makin finds that essentially Smythe continued to abuse from 2013 up until kind of even his death in 2018. So the failure to act in 2013 in and of itself perhaps potentially enabled that to happen. And I think that made it inevitable. And at one level, what was so surprising was that he originally came out saying he'd thought about resigning but had decided not to. People have advised him. And then, of course, all the media pressure. And I think at one level, an honourable resignation that might have recognised what the report found had turned into a forced resignation.
I couldn't believe how long it took him to resign. I was messaging Joel earlier in the week saying I couldn't believe he hadn't resigned, and then of course he did. But it should have come sooner, I think, based on what he knew.
I mean, there are other investigations ongoing on. It's worth saying that this is a live story. And it's difficult because you do want immediate responses, but we do need to wait. I mean, the Makin Report, we've had to wait for ages for it. It's gone through lots of different processes that it's had to go through. But I think the Daily Telegraph reported this week there's quite a large number of Anglican clergy who are currently under investigation, and you'd have to say rightly so. If they're people who knew and didn't do anything, I think that's right, and I think that's a fairly robust process, isn't it, John? I think there are people who throw brickbats at the disciplinary measures in the Church of England for various reasons, especially where they've been on the receiving end of it. But it is a rigorous. Is it illegal, quasi-legal? How would you describe it? I don't know.
The Telegraph reported that the Church of England has appointed a QC to draw up criteria by which the behaviour of people who knew about Smythe can be judged. I think there are about 30 people who the Telegraph suggested were being investigated, and whether clergy disciplinary measures would be needed, whether they're safeguarding risks. There's already one other person who's been suspended in ministry as a result of their involvement. And I think reading the report, obviously a number of people are named, people that many people will know. They give sort of explanations of what they were told and how they responded to it. Of course, we don't have anything like the full information about that. So I think something like this is a way of those individuals being investigated, held to account. And at one level, it's easy for people to draw conclusions on the relatively limited amount of material that Makin reports. But actually, that's a very small amount of what happened and what people knew. There's going to be the levels of those who knew a lot about what happened to those who were sort of told something and were kind of reassured that something was being done. So I think this is a right process to judge the culpability of people at every part of that spectrum. And I think we've got to, in a sense, wait and trust for that to be worked through.
It's worth saying, Phil, I think this, lots of people listening will say, well, it's not our world. And there's a sense in which that is right. But I think it is a stain on the name of Christ and evangelicalism. So we do need to feel the weight of that. And I think there is another lesson embedded in there as well. It seems to me that in some of the cover-up that went on, what was invoked was, this will damage the name of Christ if it gets out.
So thus it should be covered over.
And thus it should be covered up. That's
more
not
important.
Acceptable. It's not acceptable. And that is used in a number of different constituencies, in a number of different settings as excuse for ungodly behaviour. I mean, this is heinous and criminal behaviour, but there's a range of bad, ungodly behaviours which are often covered up or excused with the same kind of justification. And the irony is that as evangelicals, we say we believe in a big God, and then yet we don't think God can defend himself. I mean, Christ can defend himself. And I think when you hear about behaviours being covered up or excused because it's going to damage the name of Christ, I think alarm bells should be ringing.
I think there are a couple of things worth kind of just bearing in mind. I think here in this case, it was the case there was no doubt at all that this abuse happened. This was abuse that was known. the actual people admitted that they'd been involved in this abuse. So we're basically talking about with people dealing with known abuse.
Yes, and criminal.
And criminal.
Yeah.
It's more difficult where people are dealing with allegations of abuse and it's not necessarily known whether it happened or not, and there are different stories, and that's a slightly different thing to be worked out. But here we're dealing with absolutely known abuse of the worst possible kind and managing what happened to it. So it's worth bearing that on mind. That means it's different from some other situations. I think also it's vitally important to remember, keep the focus on why the Archbishop of Canterbury resigned in this instance. So lots of political stuff going on within the Church of England and has been. It's easy for people to leap onto this for a whole variety of other causes.
Glenn Scrivener was helpful on that. Actually,
absolutely.
We could link that in the show notes.
But I do think actually a clarity of focus, the reason for this is basically because of the failing to deal with this very specific abuse situation, both institutionally and at a personal level.
Brothers, let's move to something else. This has been sobering and difficult, and we didn't want to shy away from it. And there will be no doubt more to say as this moves forward. But just absolutely harrowing. Not the only news story that's dominated the headlines, though it has been very close to our world this week. We have got a new US president. And an old one who has returned,
and a new US House of Representatives and a new US Senate. And those three things are important. And all the focus is on Donald Trump, obviously, but those three things are important because the political landscape is shaped not just by the president in the States, but by Congress and those have all become Republican.
I was going to say everything's become Republican. I was chatting to an American at our leaders conference last week. One of the things they said to me was, although they had no time for Donald Trump, they felt this was the best outcome for America, which I thought was an interesting thing to say. So it's fascinating how it's kind of played out. The mainstream media, nobody thought this would happen, but we woke up last Tuesday morning, whenever it was, to a new Wednesday morning. Thank you. To a new
and a quite comfortable victory. In the end.
It wasn't even close, and there was no fascinating. Really, was it that unexpected?
Well, I think it was unexpected in that the polls didn't show that it was quite that close. So, I mean, you obviously got various sides, and the liberal media has a certain kind of bias as to what they want to happen. But actually, most of the people were not calling the election at an earlier stage. So there does seem to have been some sense under recognition of the support for Donald Trump, and indeed perhaps hostility towards Kamala Harris and her side there. And I mean, that's the glory of democracy, isn't it? Is that people actually have the right to express their opinion. In this situation, people have voted with their eyes open about Donald Trump and everything they've heard. He's been in office before. And I think for the sake of America, a clear result is better than something that was sort of being contested and argued and very small. And providentially, as Christians, we believe that God overrules things like this. And for whatever reason, Donald Trump has been raised up to office. And actually, the challenge now will be governing. He faces massive challenges. He's got immense power, both because of the victory and the circumstances of the victory, and indeed because of the control of the legislature. He has a pretty free hand in terms of appointing people to support him, and he seems to be choosing almost entirely loyalists who are behind him. That may mean that perhaps there isn't a critical voice that can be heard. So it remains to be seen how he actually governs.
What do you make of some of the picks, Adrian?
Well, it's difficult to tell, isn't it? Because I think we're one step removed from US politics. So we get headlines and we get stories. We don't always, we see a name. So like the Attorney General is a name that if you were in the States, especially if you come from Florida, you would know very, very well. I never heard of him. But then, in the first paragraph of the first story I was reading, I was told he'd been investigated for certain offences and is still under investigation for certain offences, which seems a bizarre pick for an Attorney General. But I just know about these people what's been fed me, essentially. And that's true for Robert Kennedy Jr. as well, who's been made the Health Secretary. The first paragraph of every report will tell you he's an anti-vaxxer. And you sort of just wonder about how that's going to work in terms of the Health Secretary. I think the most high-profile appointment has to be Elon Musk. Yeah. We do know a bit more about him. He's been appointed co-leader, which raises all sorts of questions how that's going to work. Co-leader of a department to basically save money, which the US government will need to do because they're overspending like most Western governments. They've got COVID balances to try and save So yeah, who knows? I mean, these people are all very outspoken. I mean, there's an underlying question about all of them, actually, including Donald Trump, which is how much the public persona of them actually reflects the real thing, or whether they're essentially playing to the crowd. And I think those things are very difficult to tell, Phil. So they all look like odd appointments. It's worth remembering, of course, in Trump's first presidential sort of 4-year period, he got through quite a lot of appointments. He had 4 chiefs of staff, for example, in 4 years. So just because these are the initial appointments doesn't mean they're the ones that are going to stick.
Interesting to see some commentary over here, John, saying that actually this is good for the gospel. Whatever you might think of Donald Trump and his character, this is actually good for Christian principles, particularly around rights for the unborn and the like.
I think that remains to be seen in terms of the platform as a whole. I'm very nervous about people pinning the gospel on any political movement. Politicians on both sides sort of do some things in line with the gospel, some not. I wouldn't be. I understand why people have a tribal connection with those who they think most represent their philosophy. It remains to be seen. I think that. If you say biblically, what is the goal of government? The answer is freedom of religion, freedom to be able to proclaim the gospel, the preservation of civic order. Those are the expectations of the New Testament. So I think actually it's very dangerous to pin our kind of unfolding of Christian mission and the idea that a particular politician will be the one who will do that. That presupposes the difference between the two sides is so big. I mean, even on abortion, for example, Donald Trump has changed the position of the Republican Party on pro-life. He's not pro-life in the way that he was originally. There's been a lot of criticism for that. And in fact, in the elections, quite a number of states voted for pro-choice positions within the state. So by no means does the mere appointment of Donald Trump necessarily mean that will change, because his position, the abolition of Roe and Wade, was to say this is a matter now for the states, and choices will be made there. I do think more broadly in the Western world, there are some issues that are flowing out of Donald Trump and happening in lots and lots of places, which is there is clearly political realignment. There is the challenge that essentially progressive movements have become elite and patronising and have lost touch with kind of many people who feel left behind and not listened to, economics and sort of those, again, people who are struggling. Inflation has obviously been a key thing. So kind of many people feel that life is leaving them behind. They feel that the liberal progressive agenda is not serving them. I think there's a massive problem with men in society and how they feel demonized by much of the culture, and it's clear that that has influenced voting patterns there. And I think the challenge for us as Christians is that actually, in a sense, that we just can't leap just on one side of that culture war or another, and the gospel is not a culture war in that sense. We have to kind of, in a sense, bring a gospel perspective to both of those things. But there is a vital lesson there about, in a sense, keeping in touch with the community and people as a whole. And obviously, a whole raft of politicians have failed to do that.
This news arrived during our leaders' conference. Let's just reflect on our time in Blackpool for a few minutes. We had a great time last week. We should be very grateful to the Lord.
Very happy time. I mean, the evangelical world has been slightly overshadowed by Makin since then, but actually we had a great time in Blackpool. We had 1,100 leaders gather to think about shepherding in its broadest sense, what that means to look after, to care for the flock, to feed the flock, to love the flock, which everybody in leadership, in Christian leadership, is involved with in some way, either directly or indirectly. We were really helped by a lot of class input, especially from Brian Croft, but not only.
Excellent, wasn't he?
From Brian Croft. I'm looking forward to all that, all those resources being made available. I didn't get to hear any of the seminars. I was rushing around and hosting the conference. So I'm looking forward to catching up with lots of seminars, lots of good content. We've had great feedback, and just very grateful to God for answered prayers. But I think the thing that struck me most, Phil, from the leaders' conference was we had a prayer gathering, and we got people on the app. We have an app for the conference, and on the discussion thread on the app, we got people to post what the Lord was doing where they were. We have 500 people post, a little sentence or two just in the space of a couple of minutes. We're going to turn that into a web article just with 500 bullet points, because it's just, I've committed to that now.
It was extraordinary. It was
the Lord is at work, and people being saved. Some remarkable stories. Someone who came to a kids club, 70 years ago being saved, and he just
in our 80s,
and story after story like that, which just, I was quite choked up. I was leaving that session, I was quite choked up. We actually spent a bit longer in that session praying than we intended in that particular little slot, because I couldn't quite collect my words together and pause together. So yeah, just hugely encouraged really that what we've been hearing anecdotally is now borne out by some of that data that's coming in, that people are being saved, churches are growing, the gospel is going out in a climate that looks very, very unfriendly for the gospel, you would think. But no, the gospel is growing, and it's hugely encouraging.
I think that's right. And again, it confirmed the picture that we've seen, which is churches reporting growth, more people coming into them, more people being converted. People are positive, lots of churches struggling with buildings being full, looking for new buildings. I mean, that was just wonderfully encouraging to hear that from across the constituency. Yeah. And whilst at the moment it's easy to be very discouraged about the church and evangelicalism, stories in the media that have high profile that are shaming, at the same time, at a very local church level, people are being drawn into church by the loving relationships that they meet with Christians. So the media story passes quite rapidly. And actually, people do have a prejudiced view against the church. They've had that for some time because they hear stories of abuse in whether the Catholic Church or other churches, or divisions within the church, and occasionally makes the news media. But
actually, they hear that we're very small and declining.
Yeah. But what draws people to Christ ultimately is the witness and the love of local churches. And we must not think that everything that happens that God is doing at the level of the kind of the synod, the big discussions, the kind of debates on kind of the internet between kind of Christian leaders and groups. Actually, it's that grassroots level gospel witness that is generally growing.
Praise God for the local church.
Yeah, absolutely. And just tell us a bit about next year while we're here, Adrian. So
next year we're thinking about world mission. It's a really important topic, and one that should thrill our hearts and challenge us in equal measure. I guess for many leaders, it's not top of their agenda. But I think it should take a high profile. We're part of a local church, all of us. We're part of a kind of a national grouping of churches, but we're part of a worldwide church. And to be interested in that and wanting to see the gospel go out in all kinds of places. There are great stories to hear, Phil, and there are great things to be praying for and giving ourselves to. We may feel small, but actually it's in our smallness that sometimes we can be most effective in sending out and reaching out with the gospel.
Excellent. John, you wanted to pick up on the new Gladiator film. Can we talk about that for a few moments? Why did you especially want to bring that up here? What lessons do you think we can learn
That's great.
from it?
Well, I think it's released.
FIEC film reviews.
It's released today. It comes out.
It is.
Gladiator
It's
film.
role performance last night, didn't it? Online.
Very good.
Obviously, this film is set and gives something of an impression of life in Rome, in the Roman Empire, in biblical times. And I think it's very interesting in a sense that that's being covered. From a Christian perspective, I think that the gladiatorial games was actually at the very heart of a lot of the brutality and the wickedness of the Roman Empire, the way it viewed human life, its social structures, the way that people were treated. The idea that kind of the great public entertainment was essentially fights to the death, public executions, the killing of animals. And actually emperors and politicians put these vast games on because that's how you got popular sport. So I mean, it sheds a light on the reality of what the Roman world was really like. I think some people can have this naive view of this kind of lovely classicalism, and actually it was a pretty brutal and appalling world. You can expand that out to the way slaves were treated, the way women were treated, the way children were treated. So at one level, the film perhaps sheds a window on that and some measure of historical authenticity. And I think we can easily forget that that's the world into which Christianity was birthed. Yeah. And it's also the world in which the gospel ultimately transformed. One of the things that's really striking is the early Christians were utterly opposed to the games, both because of their brutality, but also because they were religious ceremonies. They were ways of placating the Roman gods. And it was one of the areas in which kind of Christians and people converted into Christianity totally changed their attitudes in relation to these public kind of entertainment. So here we're being reminded of something that our early Christian brothers and sisters saw as being a great evil that was to be resisted. And over time, as Christians and Christian influence grew, they ended up being banned down the line. So I think it's reflecting on that reality, it's a reminder of how wicked humanity can be. It's a reminder of the transforming power of the gospel. I think there's a broader question. I think this is true of an awful lot of things that we engage with. To what extent ought we to be entertained by, in a sense, depictions?
Are we not entertained? Yes.
What do we go to see? And I think I was just reflecting on the fact that there is a sense in which, in a virtual sense, are we, in a sense, enjoying the games in the same way that those original Romans did when we go along? I don't think necessarily that is the case with which everybody watches it. But it's just a reminder to us that actually engaging in virtual entertainment can be a way of mentally engaging in sin in a way that's not helpful. We recognise with that pornography, the law recognises that actually AI-generated images of children are just sort of as damaging to the person. It's just as illegal as real images of children. So I think there's something for us to think through here about the way we take these things in. I personally haven't watched the first Gladiator film, partly because I'm squeamish, partly because I feel sort of not necessarily good for me to do that. That might not be true for everybody. So I think I'm unlikely to go and see this. And I'm reminded of Paul's words, everything is permissible, not everything is beneficial. They're all judgments that individuals need to make. And I think for a lot of the things we watch, we need to much more carefully ask the question, what impact is this having on me? What am I celebrating? Sometimes things in films, entertainment are incidental to something bigger, and they don't have that impact on you. Sometimes when it's the focus in and of itself, I think it can be shaping of attitudes and outlook. And that goes not just for this film, that goes for a whole load of activities and things that we might engage in. We need to be, I think, careful to think through, what does entertainment do to us? And what is it about it that we find attractive?
It's also not very good.
It's only got 2 stars, you were saying.
The Times gave it 2 stars and said the highlight was Denzel Washington's bisexual slave trader, which didn't make me think, I'd like to see that. The mind boggles. Let's talk finally about cycling. Yes.
So you've been a huge fan.
I love cycling.
Well, you're a huge fan of cycling anyway. You always like to watch the Tour de France, all that kind of stuff. Mark Cavendish has retired, but he went out with quite a bang, didn't he?
He retired on Sunday, just gone, with a win. It's quite a way to go. I did wonder, watching it, whether they let him win. But he was up against someone called Jasper Philipsen, who's not particularly kind in letting other people win, and looked as though he was lunging for the line. So I think Mark Cavendish did genuinely win his last race. He's right at the top age. It's an extraordinary story because he's overcome adversity and illness and all sorts of things to keep going, and to win the record for the most Tour de France stage wins ever. It's a very moving story, and I think he's a great contender for the sports personality of the year. But he's gone out at a high age, actually, for a cyclist,
and at the top of his game,
but still winning, and at the top of his game. He could keep going, he could win more races, but he's retiring, and I just think there's a lesson in there. Arguably one of the reasons Kamala Harris lost is because Biden didn't give up quickly enough. There's obviously been a lot of deconstruction of what's happened in the US
election. Pelosi was excoriating about that, wasn't she?
Biden should have gone earlier, and wanting to hold on to power longer than he did. That was a bad move. So yes, I think there's something in there to reflect on for church leaders. When is it right to go? When is it right to hand the baton on? And actually, even with someone like Mark Cavendish, just because you can still win races doesn't mean he should carry on racing. Just because you can still score a goal in football, just because you can still preach a good sermon, doesn't mean you should hang on. Harbour Town, you'll be interested in this, Phil, have just signed
Sandro.
How old is Sandro? Do you know?
He's only 35.
Yeah, he's 35. I thought he was young. He's still relatively young. But there is a point where it's right to know when to bow out. And I don't think the measure is, I can still preach a good sermon. Someone told me the other day of a pastor, not in this country, in a different place, who just turns up to preach the sermon. That's all he does. At which point you think, that's not a pastor, I don't think. That sounds like an itinerant preacher on the payroll. So I do think there's a lesson there for leaders as we near retirement, as we get older. We need to reflect on what that means and what it looks like. I heard of a pastor the other day who was just saying, I'm entering the last 5 to 10 years of ministry. I want to look for somewhere where I can be a number 2 and help to a younger guy. But things like that make my heart sing, actually. And there is a sense in which we do need to know when to stop and when to take on different roles. And we all know of churches where that's not happened and it's been catastrophic.
I think that's right. And I mean, at one level, Mark Cavendish went out on the top. I think in ministry, you don't have quite that competitivity where it will be evident necessarily that there's that decline. And sometimes people keep going and nobody has the heart to tell them that they're
there is that as well.
Ministering in their same way. I also think that actually there are times to stop. But there's a point in leadership at which you've got nothing really more to give. It's just kind of treading water. And actually, for the sake of the organisation, the church, the ministry, are you actually, in a sense, holding it back? Even if you're doing some things well and to a good level, actually, it may well be preventing it forward. And then there's the other question of, are you basically preventing others who might be able to step into the role and be able to take things forward? So I think those are equal factors in terms of people thinking, when is the right time? Sort of, in a sense, to step away.
Excellent. Well, brothers, time has beaten us. Let's leave it there. I was curious to note that Sandro is suspended for his first 2 games at Harbour Town because of racking up so many yellow cards.
So does he get to play in the FA Cup second round match? That's the key question.
I don't know the answer to that. Reading away. I'm not certain of the answer to that.
That's what they've got.
My father was delighted to meet Sandro last weekend, so it's a great story, isn't it? Brothers, thank you so much for talking about what's been going on in the news. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Do rate or leave a review so others can find it, and we'll speak to you again very soon.